Somewhere over the Pacific, in the summer of 1942, a Japanese Zero pilot spots it through the shimmer of heat and salt spray, a hulking silhouette against the clouds, moving with all the grace of a pregnant whale. He clicks his radio transmitter and laughs. His wingmen join in. The thing is enormous, ungainly, and slow. Its wings stretch wide like the arms of a drowning man. Its boat-shaped hull seems to belong more to the ocean below than the sky above. They call it names. The flying bathtub. The American turtle. One pilot jokes that he could loop around it 3 times before it even noticed. And perhaps he could. The Consolidated PBY Catalina, this lumbering, twin-engine seaplane, seems less a weapon of war and more a relic of some optimistic peacetime dream. It has no speed to escape. No armor to withstand bullets. No teeth to bite back. To these men, trained in the world's most agile fighter planes, it is a joke written in aluminum and rivets. But mockery, like hubris, has a way of aging poorly. Because while those Zero pilots laugh and bank away, returning to their carrier or island base, the Catalina continues its slow, deliberate crawl across the sky. Its crew, cramped, exhausted, salt-stained, sit at their stations with headsets and binoculars, quietly recording every detail. Ship positions. Fleet movements. The direction of smoke trails on the horizon. They transmit coded messages back to headquarters, messages that will reach admirals and intelligence officers long before the Japanese know they've been seen. The pilots mock what moves slowly. But they do not yet understand what moves deliberately. They see a plane. But what they've truly encountered is something far more dangerous, a machine designed not to fight, but to see. And in the vast, faceless sprawl of the Pacific Theater, where entire fleets can vanish into empty blue, the ability to see everything is the most lethal weapon of all. They mocked what they did not yet understand. And soon, very soon, they would learn the cost of that mistake. To understand why a slow, unarmed flying boat became the most feared reconnaissance aircraft of the Pacific War, you must first understand the ocean itself. The Pacific is not one battlefield. It is 10,000 battlefields, scattered across 64 million square miles of water. It is a wilderness of distance, an unforgiving blue desert where entire task forces can disappear for weeks, where islands are specks, and where the horizon curves away into nothing. For the Japanese Imperial Navy in early 1942, this vastness was an ally. Their fleet struck American positions at will, Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, then melted back into the emptiness like ghosts. The Allies, meanwhile, were blind. Radar was still primitive, its range limited to miles, not hundreds of miles. Aircraft carriers could launch scout planes, but those scouts had short legs, 2, maybe 3 hours of fuel before they had to turn back. Island bases offered lookout posts, but islands were few, and the Japanese controlled most of them. Submarines could patrol, but they moved underwater, seeing nothing until they surfaced, and by then, the enemy was often gone. So the question facing Allied commanders was both simple and impossible. How do you patrol an ocean you cannot see? How do you find a fleet that does not want to be found? The answer, it turned out, would not come from technology alone. It would come from endurance. From a willingness to fly farther, stay airborne longer, and search more stubbornly than any aircraft had before. It would come from accepting that the machine doing this work might not be glamorous or fast or even particularly safe, but that it could, if designed correctly, stay in the air long enough to turn the invisible visible. This was the gap into which the Catalina was born. Not as a fighter. Not as a bomber. But as something stranger and more essential, a flying watchtower, a tireless eye, a machine built not for the sprint but for the marathon. While the Zero pilots trained for dogfights and the bomber crews practiced their runs, the Catalina crews prepared for something else entirely, 18-hour shifts over open water, scanning the horizon until their eyes burned, reporting what they saw, and then, if they were lucky, making it home. In 1942, the idea seemed desperate. A flying boat? Against the Imperial Japanese Navy? It sounded less like a strategy and more like a last resort. But desperation, as history often shows, has a way of breeding brilliance. And the Pacific, vast and blue and merciless, was about to become the proving ground for one of the war's strangest and most vital aircraft. The Catalina did not begin its life as a weapon. It began as an idea, a sketch on an engineer's drafting table, born from a problem no one else had solved. In the mid-1930s, the United States Navy came to Consolidated Aircraft Corporation with a request that sounded almost impossible: build us a patrol plane that can fly 1,000 miles out to sea, search for hours, and still make it home. It needs to land on water. It needs to carry a crew. And it needs to do all of this without refueling. The engineers, led by a quiet genius named Isaac Laddon, stared at the specifications and realized they were being asked to design something that didn't yet exist: a flying boat with the range of a cargo plane and the seaworthiness of a ship. What they created was ugly. Beautifully, functionally ugly. The PBY Catalina had a hull shaped like a boat's bottom, wide and flat, designed to skim across waves during takeoff and land gently on swells. Its wings were mounted high, parasol style, to keep the engines clear of spray. Two Pratt & Whitney radial engines sat in nacelles atop those wings, growling with a deep, steady hum that crews would come to know as the sound of home. The plane could carry depth charges, torpedoes, and bombs, but these were almost afterthoughts. Its true payload was endurance. It could stay airborne for 24 hours. It could fly 3,000 miles without stopping. It could search an area the size of Texas in a single mission. But speed? Forget it. The Catalina cruised at barely 120 miles per hour, slower than many of the fighters hunting it. Maneuverability? Laughable. Trying to bank sharply in a Catalina was like trying to turn a city bus on a mountain road. Armor? Minimal. A well-aimed burst from a Zero could shred its thin aluminum skin like paper. And yet, when the Navy tested the first prototypes in the late 1930s, something remarkable happened. Pilots reported that the plane, despite its flaws, simply refused to quit. It absorbed punishment. It kept flying through storms that grounded other aircraft. It landed on sea so rough that observers swore it would capsize, and then it took off again. The crews began to trust it, not because it was fast or tough, but because it was stubborn. It had the soul of a mule and the heart of a workhorse. By the time war broke out in the Pacific, hundreds of Catalinas were already in service. They were stationed in the Philippines, in Hawaii, in Australia. And when the Japanese struck, these ungainly flying boats became the only eyes the Allies had left. The silent hunter had been born. Now it was time to prove itself. Imagine the inside of a Catalina at hour 16 of an 18-hour patrol. The air is thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and salt. The noise is relentless, a grinding, vibrating roar from the twin engines that makes conversation impossible without shouting. The hull is cramped, barely wide enough for a man to stand upright, and every surface is either scorching hot from the tropical sun or slick with condensation. The crew, usually 9 or 10 men, sit or crouch at their stations, eyes red from staring, backs aching from the cramped quarters. The navigator hunches over his charts, pencil in hand, calculating their position by dead reckoning and the occasional glimpse of stars through the observation dome. The radio man sits with his headset clamped tight, listening for coded messages through a wash of static. The bow gunner peers through the plexiglass nose, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the endless blue for anything: smoke, a wake, a shadow that doesn't belong. The pilots, strapped into their seats, make tiny corrections to the throttle and trim, holding the plane steady through the turbulence that rises off the ocean like breath. And below them, stretching in every direction, is nothing. Just water. Mile after mile of it, rippling and glittering under the sun, featureless as a blank page. This is the reality of reconnaissance in the Pacific War. Not glory. Not dogfights. Just hours and hours of searching, with the knowledge that missing something, one ship, one convoy, one fleet, could cost thousands of lives. The Catalina crews called it flying the empty. Some men went half-mad from the monotony. Others learned to find a strange, meditative calm in it, the way a lighthouse keeper learns to live with solitude. But then, sometimes, the emptiness breaks. A smudge on the horizon. A faint line of smoke. The glint of metal where there should be none. The bow gunner's voice crackles over the intercom. Contact. Bearing 270. Multiple ships. The navigator scrambles to mark the position. The radio man encrypts the message and taps it out in Morse code, praying it reaches headquarters before a Japanese fighter spots them. The pilots throttle up, coaxing every bit of speed from the engines, angling away from the contact, because the last thing a Catalina wants is a fight. Sometimes they make it. Sometimes they don't. There are stories of Catalinas limped home on one engine, their hull stitched with bullet holes, their crews bleeding but alive. There are other stories of planes that simply never returned, their last transmissions cut short, their wreckage never found. But whether they lived or died, the Catalinas did their job. They found the fleets. They reported the positions. They turned the vast, invisible ocean into something mappable, knowable, targetable. And slowly, mission by mission, patrol by patrol, the balance of the war began to shift. The Japanese could no longer hide. Because the eyes in the sky never blinked. June 3, 1942. Somewhere north of Midway Atoll, a single Catalina cuts through the darkness. The pilot, Ensign Jack Reed, has been flying for nearly 11 hours. His eyes ache. His hands are numb on the controls. The co-pilot beside him fights to stay awake, sipping cold coffee from a dented thermos. Below them, the Pacific is black as ink, the kind of darkness that swallows light and gives nothing back. Above, a thin scattering of stars. No moon. No landmarks. Just the hum of the engines and the faint glow of the instrument panel. They are hunting. American intelligence knows the Japanese are coming. Code breakers have intercepted messages. The Imperial Navy is moving a massive fleet toward Midway, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, intent on luring what's left of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap. But knowing the enemy is coming and finding them are two very different things. Dozens of Catalinas have been sent out in a wide search pattern, each assigned a sector of ocean to scour. Most will find nothing. A few might find everything. Reed's sector is the northwest quadrant, 700 miles from Midway. He flies low, just a few hundred feet above the water, where the Catalina's radar, primitive but functional, has the best chance of picking up surface contacts. The crew is silent, tense. They know what's at stake. If they find the fleet and report its position, the American carriers waiting near Midway will have a chance. If they don't, if the Japanese strike first, the war in the Pacific could be over. And then, at 0925 hours, the radar operator's voice breaks the silence. Contact. Multiple returns. Bearing 320. Range 30 miles. Reed's heart hammers. He banks the Catalina toward the contact, climbing slightly to get a visual. The clouds are low and patchy. He weaves between them, knowing that if Japanese fighters are in the area, the Catalina is dead. But he has to see. He has to be sure. And then the clouds part. Below him, spread across the ocean like a steel armada out of a nightmare, is the Japanese invasion fleet. Dozens of ships, transports, cruisers, destroyers, moving in tight formation, their wakes carving white lines through the dark water. Reed counts them, his co-pilot scribbling notes. The radio man begins transmitting immediately, encoding the fleet's position, course, and speed. The message goes out in bursts, repeated 3 times to ensure it's received. They've done it. They found the fleet. But now comes the hard part, getting out alive. Reed dives back into the clouds, throttling up, praying the Japanese radar hasn't spotted them. Behind him, the fleet continues its advance, unaware that their position has just been radioed to every American commander in the Pacific. 3 days later, at the Battle of Midway, American dive bombers will sink for Japanese carriers in one of the most decisive naval battles in history. And it will all trace back to this moment, a single Catalina, flown by an exhausted crew, finding the enemy in the dark. The machine they mocked had just changed the war. After Midway, the Catalina's role evolved. It was no longer just the eye in the sky, it became the ghost in the night. As the Allies pushed westward, retaking islands and hunting Japanese convoys, the Catalina adapted. Some were painted matte black and fitted with special exhaust baffles to hide their engine glow. These Black Cats, as they came to be known, flew nighttime harassment missions, dropping bombs on enemy airfields, strafing supply ships, and vanishing before dawn. Japanese soldiers on isolated garrisons began to dread the sound of that slow, droning engine in the darkness. It meant they were being watched. It meant an attack was coming. And there was nothing they could do about it. Other Catalinas took on a more humane mission, search and rescue. In the vast stretches of the Pacific, downed pilots often had no hope of survival unless someone found them within hours. The Catalina, with its ability to land on open water, became a lifeline. Crews would spot a raft or a life vest from miles away, circle to mark the position, and then, if the seas allowed, land beside the survivor and pull them aboard. Hundreds of pilots, American and Allied, owed their lives to a Catalina crew who refused to leave them behind. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was psychological. The Japanese pilots who once mocked the flying boat now feared it. They called it Kyowa Nikko, the Black Cat, and spoke of it in the same hushed tones reserved for night bombers and submarines. The Catalina had become a legend, not because it was deadly, but because it was everywhere. It could appear without warning, report your position, guide an attack, and disappear before you could respond. It was the plane you couldn't catch and couldn't hide from. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Catalinas coordinated bombing runs that sank an entire Japanese convoy. At Guadalcanal, they patrolled that slot, the channel where Japanese destroyers ran supplies under cover of darkness, and radioed their positions to waiting PT boats. In the Philippine Sea, they guided carrier strikes that crippled Japan's remaining naval air power. The Catalina was never the star of these battles. It was the invisible hand behind them, the quiet, unglamorous workhorse that made victory possible. And the crews who flew it, exhausted and unsung, understood this. They didn't need parades or medals. They had something better, the knowledge that every mission mattered. That every contact report saved lives. That the plane they flew, ugly, slow, and stubborn, was winning the war one sighting at a time. The mockery had turned to fear. And fear, in the end, had turned to respect. But who were these men who flew the Catalinas? What kind of person volunteers to spend 18 hours in a cramped, freezing hull, staring at empty ocean, knowing that at any moment a Zero could appear and turn their aircraft into a fireball? The answer, it turns out, is ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Most Catalina crews were not career military. They were civilians who enlisted after Pearl Harbor, mechanics, farmers, college students, men who learned to navigate by stars, operate radios, and fix engines mid-flight because there was no other choice. They came from small towns in Kansas and fishing villages in Maine and dusty ranches in Texas. They missed their families. They complained about the food. They played cards to pass the time and wrote letters home that never mentioned how scared they were. One navigator kept a diary, later declassified, in which he described the strange duality of patrol life. Hours of boredom, he wrote, interrupted by moments of pure terror. He described flying through typhoons, the Catalina bucking and groaning, wings flexing so violently it seemed they would snap. He described spotting a Japanese battleship at dawn and watching it turn toward them, knowing they were too slow to escape. He described the relief, almost euphoric, of landing back at base after a 20-hour mission, the crew stumbling out onto the dock, legs barely able to hold them up. Another crewman, a radioman from Ohio, wrote about the cold. People think the Pacific is warm, he noted. But at altitude, at night, you freeze. We'd wrap ourselves in blankets and still shiver. Your fingers go numb. You can't feel the Morse key. You just tap and hope it's right. And yet, despite the hardship, there was pride. A quiet, stubborn pride in doing a job no one else could do. The Catalina crews didn't have the glamour of fighter aces or the glory of bomber squadrons. But they had something else, a sense of purpose. They were the eyes. The watchers. The ones who made sure the enemy could never truly hide. One pilot, interviewed decades after the war, summed it up perfectly: "We didn't fly to be heroes. We flew because someone had to. And that was enough." They were the forgotten heroes of the sky. And their legacy is written not in headlines, but in the survival of those who never knew they were being protected. The war ended. The Catalinas came home. Most were scrapped, melted down for aluminum, their parts recycled into peacetime machinery. A few were sold to civilian operators, converted into airliners or cargo planes, their gun turrets removed, their military markings painted over. They flew mail routes in Alaska, ferried supplies to remote islands, served as bush planes in the Canadian wilderness. For a while, you could still hear that distinctive twin-engine drone over the Pacific, though now it carried tourists instead of torpedoes. But slowly, inevitably, they disappeared. Faster planes replaced them. Jet engines made propellers obsolete. Satellites and radar networks took over the job of reconnaissance. By the 1960s, the Catalina was a relic, a footnote in aviation history, remembered only by the aging men who had flown them. And yet, the legacy endures. Modern maritime patrol aircraft, the P-3 Orions, the P-8 Poseidons, trace their lineage directly back to the Catalina. The principles it pioneered, long-range patrol, search and rescue, anti-submarine warfare, are still the foundation of naval aviation. Every time a plane takes off to search for a missing vessel, every time a crew scans the ocean for threats, they are following in the wake of those lumbering flying boats that once crossed the Pacific. But perhaps the deeper legacy is the lesson the Catalina taught, that war is not always won by the fastest or the strongest. Sometimes it's won by the stubborn, the unglamorous, the machines and men who simply refuse to quit. The Japanese pilots mocked the flying boat because it was slow. They laughed because it was clumsy. They dismissed it because it couldn't fight. But they learned, too late, that speed is not the same as effectiveness. That the plane you underestimate is often the one that defeats you. And so, on calm days, when the Pacific stretches blue and endless beneath the sun, it's worth remembering the Catalinas. The flying boats that found every hidden fleet. The eyes that never blinked. The machines that were mocked until they won the war.